Hey everybody, welcome to the podcast. I am Steven.
And I'm Daniel.
And we are still alive. It has been a while. We do apologize. Things got pretty busy in our personal lives, professional lives, so we're excited to come back to our first 500-year series. The last episode that we had left off on was exorcism in the early church, specifically in the 2nd century. So we're going to continue that today, and of course, if you like what we're doing here, if you like the first 500-year series, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Like this video, comment. We do respond to most of the comments. And
tap the bell for notifications.
Tap the bell for notifications so that you can be a part of this experience every single time that an episode drops.
I'm just happy I didn't forget my part.
And I'm happy you made it here today. So we are sitting across from each other in this makeshift studio that once was my office until about 5 minutes ago. We are holding microphones, so this is very makeshift, but we're going to make this work. Tomorrow's Thanksgiving, so we had the privilege of being able to sit across from each other. It's been a long time since we've sat across from each other, actually.
Yeah.
I don't even know how to do this.
Usually remote.
It's kind of weird. Mm-hmm. I mean, when we did this, it was the early days where we had lav mics and...
We're in my dining room.
In your dining room, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, we've come a long way, obviously. So
we've made it to your study.
This is what it looks like to make it, people. All right, so where we left off was we talked about how the Christian movement is moving beyond merely evangelizing amongst Jews and this group of Gentiles called the God-fearers. And God-fearers, to remind everybody, were Gentiles that in one way or another and in differing nearness and farness, attach themselves to the life of a local synagogue, and acknowledged Yahweh and Yahwism in general. So that was the God-fearers, and it was pretty low-hanging fruit for the early Christian movement to evangelize among these peoples. So a lot of the early controversies of the 1st century with circumcision and all that was mainly dealing with this kind of intra-Jewish debate. That included, like, what are we going to do with these God-fearers with regard to circumcision? Now, when we move into the 2nd century, we're moving beyond that circle, and we're looking towards the pagan world that knows nothing of this, is not a part of this Jewish milieu. So what we talked about in the last episode was that Christians, their view of the world was very much informed by Hebraism, and its view of the Gentile nations as being under the domination of these gods, these divinities that God had originally created to lead the nations back to him, but who, through subsequent history from the Tower of Babel onward, had coaxed these nations into worshiping them and had formed bargains and pacts with the peoples. Each city sort of had its own god that it was especially devoted to. And we talked about how with the building of empire, we start to see the amalgamation of gods, and the pantheon is building. So now, of course, here in the Greco-Roman world, the Christians, they saw that what needed to happen first with this group was that they needed to have those bonds with those gods broken first. And that was typically through the rite of exorcism, which is why exorcism becomes so closely linked with the rite of a Christian initiation, which is baptism. So it's like you're exorcised first, and then you're baptized, and now you're a full part of the community. Your ties to the gods are broken. That mafia-like relationship, which the way that Christians saw it, has now been broken, and you're free.
And we started to kind of explain or start to answer the question of how does Christianity begin to spread? Yeah. And part of that answer was through miracles and exorcism. You know, if we look at the sources, that's what the sources tell us, that people believed that miracles were happening among the Christians. People believed that they had the authority, pagans from pagan sources, that Christians had the authority to rule over these demons that we thought were gods, and it was super effective in many circles.
Yeah, and we left off talking a little bit about how we could see, for many, that the impact of that message would have been in a subjective way, like very powerful, to hear that, what have these gods ever done for you? Really, For some, we'll talk in this episode a little bit differently, but
well, it changed their whole cosmology. It threw everything upside down. Mm-hmm. It took all of the Roman system and said that system is actually evil. Yeah. And those aren't gods, those are demons. Everything was switched for them. That was no small feat by the Christians to accomplish. I mean, it's going to take hundreds of years for that message to get through. But the beginnings of it are happening here in the 2nd century.
So what we're going to do in this episode now is flip the table. We've seen the Greco-Roman pagan world from the eyes of these early Christians. Now we're going to flip it, and we're going to understand Greco-Roman religion and public life from their eyes. And we're going to look back at this small cult that keeps kind of popping up in city after city, especially as we move into the mid-2nd century, is starting to become more noticeable.
Yeah, we're in the tens of thousands now throughout the empire.
Yeah. And so now we're gonna put on our pagan lenses and look back into Christianity, and perhaps by the end of this we'll be able to see why Roman authorities would have taken this hostile stance in many portions of its history towards this movement.
But I also hope we accomplish in this episode, and we show folks that there's a vitality to paganism. I think the tendency is to say, well, yeah, I mean, look at the Christians, how well organized they are. They got great theology. They have some philosophers. Of course they're going to overtake the empire. It's not inevitable. This is a hard-fought battle. And hopefully by the end of the episode, you'll see that, no, the pagans had reasonable, rational arguments against the Christians. And Roman religion was very sober and rational and reasonable. And there's a lot of reasons for that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, that these early Christians especially, we can tend to think like, oh yeah, of course, like Christianity, Christendom. I mean, Aquinas, Augustine, St. John Chrysostom, these great figures of Christianity. Of course, Christianity was going to be a force to reckon with, with the Roman Empire. Not at this stage. We're talking about nobodies. I mean, for the pagans, they're looking at these Christians, they say, oh yeah, Ignatius of Antioch. To us, that's a champion. But at this time, that was nobody. It's a nobody. Mm-hmm. You're coming up against what, Plato? You're coming up against like the philosophers, the philosophical tradition that we have, plus like generations and generations of our religion. So we have to try to get into their mindset and understand it. And we hope that by the end of it, we'll have a rounded out picture of how the Christian movement is spreading and what that looks like across the empire. So to start that off then, Dan, why don't you kind of set the stage for us with Roman religion? Give us like the 30,000-foot view of what makes Romans tick. What is their religion like? What's their public life like?
Yeah, what are the perspectives? What are their motivations? What is their religion like? Traditional Roman religion like? I think it's obvious. So we're not gonna go into the obvious pantheon, right? Jupiter, Juno, Minerva, all of the god Mars, and all the pantheon of gods. Those are there. We don't have to go deep into that, but yes, it is obviously a polytheistic religion at a high level. What we really want to do is perhaps get a sense of, like you said, what made them tick. How did they think about things? How did they think about the gods? How did they practice their rites? Those types of things, so that we can better understand them. We don't need to understand all the ins and outs of the religion, basically.
Yeah.
So I think there's a good source that kind of can get us started. It's from the Roman pontiff Cotta. And Cotta says this about the religion of Rome. The entirety of the religio of the Roman people is divided into rites and auspices, to which is added a third thing, namely whatever warnings the interpreters of the Sibylline books issue for the sake of foreknowledge on the basis of portents and omens. I hold that none of these religiones should ever be neglected, and I have persuaded myself that Romulus and Numa laid the foundations of our state by establishing the auspices and rites, respectively, and that our state could never have become so great without the greatest appeasement of the immortal gods. It's a great summary, isn't it? We have our priests, we have our auspices, our augurs, auspices taken by augurs, and we have the Sibylline books. The Sibylline books, lost, unfortunately, to history, were so the Sibylline prophecies, Greek prophecies that were eventually written down in the classical age into books. it was through legend, it was transferred over to the Romans, and the Romans kept these books, but they kept them super, super secret. And what they were just books and lists of oracles, right? So anytime something would happen in Rome, hey, we're being invaded, or we are invading somebody, or there's a question politically or socially, Roman leaders would consult the books. And they had special priests who kept these books secret from everybody else. And whoever wanted to know, the emperor, whoever, would go to them, and they would consult the books on this, right? We're going to invade this town. How should we approach it, right? They'd go to the books and see if there's an oracle that they can find to then tell them what they should do. And so you see in these big dynamic moments throughout Roman history of them consulting the books. Mm-hmm. Those books end up disappearing, and they're kind of rewritten based on what they hear from oracles again as we move into the empire, but then completely lost to history. So we actually don't know what was contained in the books. We get little glimpses of decisions that were made based on the books, but the Sibylline oracles are there. But more importantly, you have the priesthoods and the rites. And then you have augurs who look at the signs of the times, and they give you the omen.
Or right? Reading entrails,
they give you a reading.
Flights of birds.
Right. Yeah. And what does it mean? But that's short term. There's not a sense in Roman religion of the ongoing prophecy from the gods.
Right.
Maybe you had that in the Greek world. Maybe you have it in the Christian world with the prophets,
right?
Speaking, Revelation, all that. You don't really have that in the Roman world. The omens, the augurs were there to give you, in a moment's time, here's what this means. And it lasts for one day, and then it goes away. Mm-hmm. Right? There's no future predicting of the empire. That's why in that piece from Cotta, it's important, because he says that the evidence of the greatness of our religion and the correctness of our religion, our religiones, our rites, is in the fact that, look at our empire. Mm-hmm. You see the breadth and width of our empire. So obviously we're doing something correct.
Yeah.
Okay. The couple things to know about Roman religion from a high level. The first thing to know is that it was generally mythless. Okay. Now, people will say, well, of course they had myths. Yeah, they did. They adopted myths from the Greek poets, right? Of course. And they kind of blended them with historical accounts and all those things. That's absolutely true. But the point is that myths weren't primary to them, as myths were to the Greeks.
Right.
To Romans, what was more important was understanding how the gods should be appeased. What rites are going to work in order for the gods to serve the state properly and for us to serve them properly. So the first thing is that they're generally mythless. Okay. The second thing is that, a piggyback on that, is that this is an empirical religion. They base everything they do on what worked.
Right.
So the gods are going to say some prayers, and they're going to sacrifice a certain animal. And if it goes well for them, if fortune is on their side, well, then the gods have agreed with what we have done, and they write it down, and those rites and rituals will be passed down from generation to generation.
Yeah. So in that sense, I mean, like as a modern corollary to that, you think of it like modern scientism, but with gods, and that the relationship is not merely with nature, but between nature and the gods. And so it was this kind of process of accumulation over the ages, and that's why tradition becomes important, which I'm sure you're going to talk about a little bit, but that's why tradition becomes very important. It's because they're saying that this is the accumulation of wisdom and experience of all the ages in interaction with these gods of the cities.
And that's the other reason why we would say that the Romans were generally mythless, is that they weren't primary to them, right? Those are stories they appreciated, but that wasn't primary to them. But they learned of their gods not from the poets. Mm-hmm. They learned of who their gods were by observing them, by observing how their rites and religious ceremonies, for lack of a better word, worked.
Yeah.
Right? So if it worked, now we know who this god is, how he acts, how he thinks, what he wants. Mm-hmm. That's how they learned. And that's what they passed on generation to generation. So the point here is that Roman religion, from a high level, orthodoxy is less and less important. What's more important is orthopraxy. What should we be practicing? What should we be saying to have the gods on our side, on the Roman side? And guess what? From the kingdom all the way to the start of the empire, 750 some odd years have gone by, and look at the extent of it, we're clearly appeasing the gods the way we should be appeasing them. That is a very, very tough thing to challenge if you're a Christian in the 2nd century.
Right.
There's no denying the Pax Romana. There's no denying the extent of the empire and the success that the Roman approach had in the ancient world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So from the Roman point of view, when they would go around and say conquer a people or subsume a people into the Roman Empire, one of the great strengths of Rome was that they didn't, as say the Assyrian Empire, of ages past, like they didn't see it as, oh, it's our gods versus your gods, and our gods win, and then we're going to put that into our myths that somehow this god was dethroned and now this god's taking over.
Or the Israelites.
Right.
Moving to Canaan.
Right.
Yahweh is greater than your gods.
Right. So past pagan empires, in a way, would see their gods as sort of going out to conquer these other gods. Whereas the Romans didn't tend to see it that way. They actually prided themselves on the peace of these gods between all the cities. That, look, yeah, you're worshiping whatever, Minerva over here, we've got this city over here that is more devoted to Jupiter. Over here is Isis.
Astarte over here.
Yeah, exactly. You guys have your city. You got to keep those gods appeased and happy and maintain the peace. And if you do that, it goes well for all of us.
Yeah. And so this is the other point about Roman religion, is that it's quite flexible.
Yeah.
It can bend. It can be flexible. And it means change can be inherent in the religion itself. So what we're speaking of here is in Latin evocatio, evocation, evoking of the gods, basically literally meaning summoning forth the gods. So in practice, and we have a number of instances of this throughout the history of the Romans, when the Romans would go to a rival city, like you said, it wouldn't be about Jupiter conquering, right, that city. It's more about first addressing the god of that city. Literally, they had a rite where the general, a commander, or even a priest would be brought in to address that city's god in some ceremony, to call on the god to come to the Roman side. And if you come to the Roman side, we will give you just as good, if not better, rites and ceremonies and honor, because we Romans, we know how to treat the gods. We treat them well. And so by doing that, they're able to expand their empire, but also preserve the rites and traditions that have held fast for hundreds of years, even before they got there. So now, when they are approached by a Christian, not only are they saying, oh, we've known how to appease the gods for 7 centuries, 8 centuries. No, we've been able to appease the gods who go back thousands of years. Mm-hmm. Isis from Egypt,
Right.
So very, very powerful. And so the religion of the Romans is like I said, flexible, and it can change. Okay. The Romans were super comfortable with saying that their religion was started by men in civic societies. Super comfortable saying that. They felt like, well, yeah, because it's empirical.
Yeah, we hear like, oh, it's just a man-made religion, and people will say that, like non-believers will say that as like a chide against like Christianity, and we're like, oh, no, it's not, But for Romans, they'd be like, well, of course it is.
Yeah, of course it is, because civic society predated these rites that we're now practicing today.
Yeah,
because we're learning as we go along. Cognitio Deorum, knowledge of the gods. That was a constant theme, whether you're looking at Cicero or Seneca or whomever in the Roman world. The constant theme was that, of course, our rights can change because we're learning.
Yeah,
you can never say for sure. How can you know for sure the things of heaven?
Right.
And so for the Romans, it was, what can we observe and then learn about the gods? And if something doesn't work, let's change it, right? So instauratio, repeat. Emendatio, alteration. So if you're doing a rite, you're making a sacrifice, you're saying a prayers, right? And it works, repeat it. Instauratio. If it doesn't work, emendatio, alteration, change it. Side, this kind of leaks into Roman Catholic faith too, religion too, right? the canon must be prayed properly, right? If it's not prayed properly, right? Or if you pray it and you realize you don't have enough hosts, you have to bring those hosts out. You have to reconsecrate it, right? Yeah. You can't just, throw them in, right? So a little bit of that Romanness is in the Catholic faith. But anyway, so change was fine with the Romans because it's not about knowing absolutely all the time what God wants. Yeah. It's about growing in that knowledge.
Right.
So super important.
It's the empirical discovery of what the gods want.
That's right.
Because to them, the gods were much nearer to the ancients than they are to them in the present day. That was one of the things that they believed, was that that's why even a lot of the old myths and stuff, the gods are constantly interacting with humans like in this very, imminent way. And they're saying, well, the ancients were very close to the gods. So that's why they trusted a lot of tradition. But then also going forward, there's this, like you said, this empirical approach of how are we going to navigate this relationship with the gods. And the other thing that the Romans prided themselves on was being able to enable, like you said, when they're standing before a city, they bring out this right where, like, come on our side. Because not only do we know how to worship the gods properly, but also we know how to have such a legal system that it enables the people of this city to worship the gods more piously, like that in the way that they are accustomed to doing it. Yeah. So it's like our laws don't impinge that at all, but encourage it. Yeah. And that's kind of how they saw that.
Yeah, and one of the characters of the Romans was that they're super, super scrupulous about their faith because they knew that we have to do it exactly correctly. Otherwise, we're not going to know if it worked or not. Yeah. So you have to stick to what you know, what's written down, stick to those prayers, stick to those hymns, stick to that sacrifice. Don't change anything. Yeah. Because then we're not going to be able to discern if we did it correctly or not. And we're not going to know when to change it and how to change it if we don't do that. So some of the formality of the Romans, I'd like to read a source. Yeah. So navigating the microphone here. So you're going to see a couple things in this source. This is from Pliny. Okay. So I'll just go through most of it. I'll skip some. To slaughter a sacrificial victim without a prayer does not seem to be of any avail or to constitute due consultation of the gods. In addition, there is one formula for obtaining favorable omens, another for averting evil, another for praising the gods. And we see that the highest magistrates employ definite formulas in their prayers, that not a single word may be omitted or said out of its proper place, that someone dictates from writing, and another is assigned as watcher to listen carefully, and a third is placed in charge of ordering that ceremonial silence be maintained, while a flutist plays to prevent any other words from being heard. There are memorable instances on record of the times when unlucky portents impeded and spoiled the ceremony, and when there was a mistake in the prayer, there still exists an outstanding example in the formula, and he goes through a couple examples here. We know these from a couple hundred years ago. Indeed, a Greek man and woman, their prayers have been dictated to us. If anyone should read the prayer used for this ritual, which is customarily dictated by the master of the College of the 15, he would assuredly admit the potency of the formulas, all of which are confirmed by the experience of 830 years. Various Flaccus, he was a scholar in Rome. Various Flaccus.
He got a lot of flack for this too, by the way.
Yeah, he did. Cites authors whom he considers reliable to show that in sieges it was the practice of the Roman priests, before all else, to summon forth the tutelary divinity of the town and to promise him the same or more splendid rights among the Romans. And this ritual still exists in the discipline of the pontiffs. So we see the formalism. Yeah. We see there's checkers, there's a second and third person present at the rites to make sure, hey, is that priest doing what he's supposed to be doing? Right. And you over there, play the flute, because I don't want any other words getting mixed up with the priest's words. Yeah. Right? We got to block out all other sound. Okay, we can't have anything else ascending to the gods but the priest's words. And then, of course, at the end, you see the concept of evocatio, the summoning forth of the other town's god. Hey, come on over to our side. We know how to appease you. Right. We're the best at what we do. Right. We're a pious people.
Great.
And that's how the Romans saw themselves, right? They saw themselves as the most pious of all the ancients.
Yeah, there's a sense in which the Romans And whether or not, on the ground and at all times this is true, but in our popular imagination, because of a lot of Christian propaganda throughout the ages about Rome, we tend to think of like these like Bacchic orgies for their worship, and like temple prostitution all day long, and ecstasy and ecstatic rites and stuff. That is not how the Romans would have characterized their religion.
Right.
The Romans prided themselves on actually being the most sober worshipers of the gods. So they would, every now and then, if they're gonna poke fun, they would poke fun at some of the excesses in Greek piety. That the Greeks would tend to have this kind of sexual element to the worship of the gods, and that they would be ecstatic and emotional and these kinds of things.
Well, it's exactly what they charge the Christians with too.
Yeah.
Orgies in their secret little meetings.
Yeah, exactly. So the Romans saw themselves as a very rational and sober people in their piety towards the gods, and that's significant because so a lot of times we think of Greece and Greek religion as sort of like the beginning of the West, but actually Greek society was kind of the final Near Eastern,
the tail end
society.
of Near Eastern,
right? It's like the tail end of the Near Eastern empires.
Yeah.
So really, if you want to understand Greek religion, you actually have to go more towards the Levant, down into Egypt. Think about the Phoenicians, right? But with Rome, they were a little bit of their own thing. Like they trace themselves to the Etruscans.
We have something from Cicero on how the Romans are the most astute and the most religious people.
So in The Nature of the Gods, he writes, "If we care to compare our national characteristics with those of foreign peoples, we shall find that, while in all other respects we are only the equals or even the inferiors of others, yet in the sense of religion, that is, in worship for the gods, we are far superior." So there's a sense, and especially that, coming from someone who is a philosopher himself and a statesman, he prides himself on the sobriety of the religion and the intellectual approach of the religion. So that's something that we need to understand when we're talking about, how do Romans see themselves as compared to other nations?
Yeah. And it's said by many others too, right? So another example, Marcus Masala in 193 BC says that we have wholly and constantly attached the highest importance to piety toward the gods. One can estimate particularly from the goodwill that we have experienced on this account from the divine. Not only that, but for many other reasons we are convinced that our own high respect for the Godhead has become manifest to the whole world. So there's a lot of places where this is being said, and clearly the Romans thought of that way themselves. But I think the ancient peoples would have agreed that the Romans were very scrupulous in their religion. I think that's across the spectrum. But there's a word that keeps coming up that it was very, very important to the Romans, and that's the word piety, right? Pietas. Take us through a little bit of pietas.
So pietas for the Romans, you really put me on the spot, huh? Take me back to my graduate days. So pietas to the Romans, if you were to sum it up,
let me take this one.
I don't like where you're going with that. If you were to sum it up into one statement, it would be one's religious and civic duty to the family, to the state, and to the gods. So you had a duty to the paterfamilias, especially the father of the family. And when we say the family here, I'm not talking about the nuclear. I'm not talking about a father, a mother, and some kids. I'm talking about a father, mother, kids, slaves, all of these extensions of the household, especially if you're a wealthy Roman. So there was a duty to show piety not only to the father of the family, but then also in the home, the household gods, which you can maybe expand on a little bit, and then duty to the state itself, to the public arena, how you serve the public thing.
See, so that defines piety, right? Mm-hmm. So to be pious in our Christian context, to be pious means he's devoted or he prays a lot or something. But to the Romans, piety meant a duty to these three things.
Yeah.
And the right order duty to those three things. And that's why Scientia Celendorum Deorum is so important. The knowledge of how to appease or how to cult the gods was super important, because how could we be pious if we don't know how to give them cult?
Right.
So one of the great foundational stories of the Romans is the story of Aeneas. Okay, Aeneas escapes from Troy, and Troy is sacked. He escapes from the city.
Wallace has sacked York. Braveheart.
Aeneas is leaving Troy, and he goes on this Mediterranean journey. But as he's leaving Troy, he's carrying a few things. He's carrying his father on his shoulder, and then he's carrying his father, who is carrying the household gods, the penates, as the Romans called them. That right there,
The pinatas.
is the pinatas. That right there is the perfect image of what Romans meant by pietas, by piety. He's carrying the leftovers of his civilization from Troy, the state. He's carrying his father, the ones who came before him, his family, and his father is upholding
The gods.
carrying them away from the trouble.
Yeah.
And as Aeneas goes through this journey in the Mediterranean, he ends up in Italy, and he intermarries with the locals, and this is where the Latins are born. The Latin peoples are born.
When in Rome, right?
When in Rome. And so Rome, the city, actually, when we think of the sacred center of Roman religion, it actually wasn't necessarily the Palatine Hill, or the Aventine, or the Capitoline Hill, or Jupiter's temple on Capitoline Hill. The center of Roman sacred traditional religion was actually in Lavinium, because that's where, by legend, Aeneas landed, married, settled, and placed those penates, the household gods.
And where's that in respect to Rome?
It's outside of Rome.
Okay.
It's away from Rome. It's not in Rome. So Lavinium and its temple was actually the center of Roman religion. And the gods that resided there did not have names, but the Romans saw them as praesentissimi, the most present ones. And they referred to them as the great ones. They never even named them, but they knew that those were our ancestral gods there. Those are the gods that Aeneas brought to us.
Those are our roots.
That we ought to honor. And those gods never left Lavinium. They stayed in Lavinium. There were no other shrines throughout the empire to the penates. Okay. They're there in Lavinium. That's important, because we've been talking so far about the kind of the public perspective and the public mindset of Roman religion. Okay. There's this whole other aspect to Roman religion, I would say, whole other aspect to Roman religion that is domestic. And it's ingrained in the homes of Romans, of all these Romans. You couldn't go anywhere in the house without encountering the gods.
This is really significant. I think this part of it is really significant to really get into the minds. We can tend to see Roman religion from this kind of top-down model of, like, the emperor and the imperial cult and the religion of the cities and the public spectacles and events. But I want to know, what does it look like inside of the daily life of a normal Roman Joe?
Yeah, for the Romans, again, that's why we're not concentrating on the pantheon. Okay, the pantheon's there.
Yeah.
The temples are there. The sacrifices and rites and priests are all there. That's all great. But to the everyday Roman, the vitality of the religion lay within the home.